I want to introduce you to Lane Kenworthy, and we're thrilled that he could find the time to come out and speak to us. And he says that income inequality has risen sharply in recent decades, and I think we're aware of that. According to some, inequality has harmful effects on economic growth, economic stability, income growth for poor and middle-class households, household balance sheets, equality of opportunity, educational attainment, health, family stability, safety, trust, happiness, and democracy. Ooh. What does the evidence tell us? And he's going to tell us. And he certainly is the guy with the experience to tell us. He's a professor of sociology and political science at the University of Arizona. His books include Social Democratic America, Progress for the Poor, Jobs with Equality, and Egalitarian Capitalism. His essays and shorter pieces appear frequently at Consider the Evidence, his own blog, Foreign Affairs, which is how I found out about him, the Washington Post, Boston Review, and lots of other periodicals and journals. So, can we welcome Lane Kenworthy?
Thanks very much. So I'm happy to be here, and I hope you find this interesting. I'm going to guess that you're going to be a little bit surprised by what I tell you in some respects, but we'll see. So, I forgot to put this slide in. So, when I was initially invited to talk, the topic was kind of left open, and I have just published this book, which has a very optimistic title and a very optimistic message, actually. But I'm not going to say anything about it, other than just to alert you to it. And if you're interested, go read it. You can get it in the library, or a cheap version on Kindle, or you can actually buy the thing. But I am going to talk about income inequality and its consequences. Now, up until very recently, those who worried or were concerned about or objected to the relatively or comparatively high level of income inequality in the United States, and the fact that it's been rising pretty steadily now for a generation, in contrast to what happened between the 1930s and the mid to late 1970s, the main source of that concern or objection was normative, was ethical. The idea is that too much income inequality is unfair, and that comes down to, for most people, the argument or the point that a lot of what determines where we end up on the income ladder has to do with luck. It has to do with genetics, the parents that we don't really get to choose, all kinds of fortuitous events that occur or don't occur during our childhood, the neighborhood we grow up in, and on and on and on. So some measure of income inequality is justifiable, wage or income inequality is justifiable, but not nearly as much, arguably, as we have here. Now, there are other reasons why you might want a little more inequality, but the point is, and the modern version of this argument, its source was this book, John Rawls, a very well-known American philosopher, published in the early 1970s, but of course the argument goes way, way back in history. Anyway, the point is, the principal concern about income inequality was ethical or normative. That's now changed, and I would have been, if somebody had told me 10 years ago that in the year 2014 or even 2011 that income inequality would be right at or near the forefront of American political debate, I would have been stunned and kind of laughed off the suggestion. But it actually has come to the forefront. It may not stay there for very long, it's hard to know, but it really is now one of the issues that's front and center in American political debate. It's got a lot of media coverage. And the main reason is that there are a slew of hypotheses or claims or arguments nowadays that income inequality, not that it's unfair, or not just that it's unfair, but that it has harmful effects on lots of other things that we care about. And here's a list of what I read off the list from the little abstract that I emailed her earlier. Everything from economic growth to all kinds of social outcomes to even to democracy. So I'm going to say a little bit about these arguments and then tell you what I think we know from the evidence we have so far to this point. Well, let me start with the hypotheses, or the claims, or the arguments themselves. So, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's valuable to have some sense of the reasons why academics and some policymakers and others think that income inequality might have these harmful effects. So we start with economic growth, which is maybe the most common outcome that you see linked to income inequality these days. And perhaps the most representative case here is, or statement of this hypothesis, is a book that Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, published a few years ago called The Price of Inequality. He makes a number of arguments in this book, but really at its core is the idea or the claim that income inequality slows down economic growth. And the gist of it, or the gist of the hypothesis is this first one here, which says that one of the things that's important for economic growth is consumer demand. We need people buying stuff. Well, the rich spend a smaller proportion or a smaller fraction of their income than the poor do, or the middle class. So middle class and poor people, almost by necessity, spend virtually everything they have. They tend to save very, very little. A generation ago, there were some who were asserting that that's bad for economic growth because you need savings and investment. And you get more of that from the rich because they don't need to spend all their income. Nowadays, we know, and economists recognize that consumer demand is really, really important as well. And so this argument has been flipped. So a generation ago, there were some people, including Milton Friedman famously, but many others too, who were saying, we ought to have more income inequality. That would be good for economic growth because we get more savings and investment. Nowadays, the argument has been turned on its head, and the notion is that we get slower growth because we don't have enough consumer demand, because too much of the money is going to the top 1%, and they just don't spend that much of it. They can't possibly spend nearly all of it. And so if we got more money to the middle class and the poor, they'd spend more of it. That'd be better for economic growth. There's another argument about fairness and work effort, but it's sort of subsidiary in this overall part of the debate. There's a hypothesis that says income inequality is bad for economic stability, and this really has come to the forefront since, of course, the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. There are a number of different reasons why that might be the case. One has to do with consumer demand, or this relationship between savings and spending. So one claim is that households end up with slow-growing incomes because too much of the middle-class households end up with slow-growing incomes because too much of the money is going to the rich. So they begin to borrow in order to keep their income, or excuse me, their consumption, their spending increasing, and they overshoot. They end up borrowing too much over a series of years, and that leads to economic instability. Another is linked to this notion that the rich end up with so much income they don't really know what to do with it. So they save a lot of it, they invest it in the beginning kind of safely, but then they have so much money that they begin looking around for speculative sources of investment that will yield higher rates of return. And again, eventually they overshoot, and that causes a financial crisis. And then thirdly, there's a political mechanism here, which says that when the rich get more money, and I'll come back to this when I say something about democracy, says that when the rich get more money, they end up having more political influence. Well, one of the things they press policymakers for is deregulation of the financial system, precisely so that they can invest in more speculative opportunities. And this too contributes to financial crisis. A third outcome here is household income growth, and I've kind of alluded to this. There's a nice film that Robert Rice, former Labor Secretary under Bill Clinton, so many of you have seen this probably. He's only one of many people, and this actually draws on a book they wrote a couple years ago called Aftershock, which really is, I mean, the title is sort of pegged to the financial crisis, but really the guts of the book is this statement that when more and more of the income in a society is going to the top 1%, or fetishize the 1%, maybe it's the 0.1%. It's almost arithmetically true that you're going to have slower income growth for households in the middle. It doesn't quite, it's not quite automatic in the sense that it could be that income inequality also contributes to faster economic growth. And so even if the richest are getting more of the household income growth, at the same time the economy is growing faster, so those in the middle can still have rapid income growth. But unless that happens, or unless the increasing share or the rising share for the 1% comes only at the expense of, let's say, the near rich. Unless either of those two things happens, it's very, very likely that you're going to have slower income growth for the middle class than the growth of the economy allows. And that's what Reich and many others have suggested. There's an argument about household balance sheets and debt. There are actually a couple of arguments along these lines. One I've kind of alluded to already that says if incomes are growing more slowly than middle-class households or low-income households have come to expect, based on the past or based on what their parents were doing or based on what they think growth of the economy should allow, they may begin to borrow more in order to fund their consumption. And then there's an argument that a Cornell economist, Robert Frank, who writes regularly for the New York Times, he has a monthly column in the business section, and so if you read that, you may come across this argument. He has a nice book called Falling Behind from about 8 or 10 years ago, I think, in which he lays this argument out, which says that most of us make relative comparisons, and so our satisfaction or appreciation of some of the things that we have hinges not on what we think of their absolute quality, but what we think of them in a relative sense. And housing is a really useful example and a really important example of this. So housing is what Robert Frank and other economists often call a positional good. So when we think of the quality of our house and how satisfied we are with it, we think of it not only in an absolute sense, but we also compare it to other houses. So one of the things that's happened, Frank says, as the richest have gotten more and more of the income in a country like the United States, is they buy bigger and fancier houses, or they redo the houses that they already own. They raise the ceilings, they put granite countertops in the kitchens, they add a few bathrooms and another bedroom and so on. And so upper middle class Americans, who formerly might have been perfectly satisfied with the house they had, now all of a sudden see these super fancy houses that the rich are either building or adding on to, and they say, wow, maybe I need to do this too. And this then trickles down to the middle class, who are comparing themselves to the upper middle class. Well, middle class folks haven't seen their incomes grow very much, so if they're going to expand their house or buy a new one, they have to borrow in order to do it. And so you begin to get this accumulation of debt. It's not, in Frank's story, it's not so much that they've come to expect rising income, but that they begin to compare their houses to these fancier and fancier houses that those above them have, and they need to keep up with the Joneses, as it were, keep up with the Vanderbilts or the Gateses or whoever the relevant comparison is. In any event, so this is a second story about why you might get growing debt in a country like the United States because of a rise in income inequality. There's a hypothesis about equality of opportunity, which we usually measure by looking at mobility between the generations. And the story here is that, of course, money is one thing that can buy better opportunity, better life chances for kids. And when the rich have more of it, they're likely to spend some fraction of that on their own kids, which gives them a better and better chance of succeeding. This too can trickle down to then the upper middle class, who begins to spend more and more money, whether it's on expensive preschools or summer camp or all kinds of other things that give kids opportunities, travel in Europe or travel to other parts of the country, private tutors, and so on. So those at the top are able to accentuate their kids' ability to stay at the top, and then poor kids who see this or simply see the widening income gap, whether it's on TV or they have some vague sense that this is going on in society, are a little bit more likely, maybe a lot more likely to lose hope that they can in fact succeed. So you get this widening in the opportunity gap between the top and the bottom. There's an argument about equality or inequality of various social outcomes like education, health, and happiness that says we know that income contributes to this gap. That is to say, we know that those with higher incomes have longer life expectancy, or that their kids are more likely to go to and graduate from college, that they're also likely to be happier than those with lower incomes. So when we see a widening of the income gap, we should expect a widening of the gap in these social outcomes. And that may be objectionable to some. There's what I think of as an even stronger argument that comes mainly from, but not exclusively from, there are lots of other people who've made this argument too, a book called The Spirit Level, which came out, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, written by 2 British epidemiologists. that argues that income inequality is bad not just for disparities or inequality of these social outcomes, but for the average level. So in other words, what they're saying is that in a country with higher income inequality, or one where inequality is growing, this will have effects on the average level of life expectancy, or the average college graduation rate, or the average degree of trust, or happiness, or crime in a society. The main reason, or the mechanism that they posit, this is Richard Wilkinson and Kate posit, is status, competition, and stress. They say we're all making comparisons with people above and below us. One of the things that we compare on is income. And so if income inequality goes up, we begin to get more anxious or stressed because we perceive ourselves as falling further and further behind. And this applies not just to the poor or the middle class, but all the way up the income ladder, they say. Even to those at the 98th percentile, because at the richest 1%, in fact, even beyond that too, even within the top 1%, because within the top 1%, the top 0.1% are seeing their incomes grow the fastest of all. So everybody, almost everybody, except those at the very, very tip top of the ladder, feels as though in this change in, or this type of change in income inequality that we've had in the United States, feels as though they're slipping further and further behind, even if their absolute incomes are going up. And this leads to stress, which is bad for, first and foremost, health. That's the thing that Wilkinson and Pickett focus most of their attention on. But all kinds of other social and some economic outcomes as well, from happiness to crime, to trust, to educational attainment, to teen births, and more beyond this. There are some other pathways through which this effect can work, but this status, competition, and stress pathway is the one that's gotten the most attention. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention here is democracy. And the notion here is very simple. Actually, there are a number of different elements of political equality or inequality, which are part and parcel of our democracy, that have been linked to income inequality. But the primary one is political influence. And so the idea here is that in a political system like ours here in America, where we know private money has some influence, in fact, a lot of influence, we would expect, it's perfectly plausible to expect that if there's a growing gap in incomes, then there'll be a growing gap in political influence. The rich will be able to buy in direct and indirect ways more influence than they formerly had, which was already more than the middle class and the poor had. And so Gibney's film Park Avenue is a nice statement of this, but there have been many, many others. Joe Stiglitz in his book The Price of Inequality devotes a lot of attention to this, and Reich in his film Inequality for All. But many, many other people have made this same sort of argument. And of course, with the Citizens United decision in 2010 and the more recent one that happened just yesterday, I guess, the McCutcheon decision, changes in the laws seem to be embracing rather than working against this possibility. Okay, so those are the hypotheses. That's a very quick sort of summary overview of these hypotheses. Now I want to say a little bit, before I get to the evidence, I want to say a little bit about how I think that we should think about assessing these hypotheses. So, any of you happen to know who this is a picture of? Some of well, many of you I know are old enough that you might remember, but I don't expect you actually will. So this is Arthur Laffer.
Laffer curve.
Yes, the famed Laffer curve. So he's standing in front of a blackboard on which this is sort of a sideways version of the Laffer curve. So the Laffer, this is a guy who is an economist, and in the mid to late 1970s, he offered a hypothesis about the relationship between the size of government, specifically tax rates. So the tax rates on individuals and also on corporations, but mainly on individuals, and government revenues. And what he asserted is that, of course, if you go from tax rates of zero, so there's no taxation, to some tax rate, a low tax rate, the government's going to raise more revenue than it formerly did. Zero, of course. But at some point, he says, there's a tipping point. So government tax rates become so high that they create very strong incentives for people to hide their money, first of all, to work less, to save and invest less, to be less likely to start new businesses. And so beyond this point, the optimal rate of taxation, government's actually paradoxically going to raise less revenue than before. Now, at the time, that was kind of controversial, but it actually shouldn't be. It's really obvious, I mean, it's manifestly true. If the tax rate was 100%, so the government took all the money from everyone, of course it's going to raise less revenue than if the tax rate was at 99%. And almost certainly if it's at 99%, it's going to raise less revenue than 98%. So that's one part of the hypothesis. There's a second element of this hypothesis, which was that Laffer was also suggesting that the United States, and by definition other rich countries, because almost all of them have higher tax rates than we do, was already beyond that tipping point. So there are really two elements of the hypothesis he was offering. A lot of folks on the left in the United States got in a tizzy about the simple statement that there was a tipping point, but that was kind of silly, because as I just said, it's almost manifestly true that there is some tipping point somewhere. The real contentious part of the claim is that we were already past the optimal point of taxation. Okay, here are three other examples of hypotheses that were made right around the same time, very much in the same vein, that asserted both that there is a tipping point beyond which the size of government is harmful for some outcome, economic growth, poverty, or a whole range of things. And the second part of the claim was that the United States, again, thanks by definition, many other rich democracies, most other rich democracies around the world, were past that tipping point, past the optimal size of government. So one is Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, which was published in 1979. Friedman's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, conservative, who was arguing very forcefully, really been doing this since the 1950s, that when government gets too big, it's very bad for the economy, also for freedom and liberty, but very importantly for economic growth and the health of the economy. Charles Murray, conservative policy analyst, published a book called Losing Ground in the early 1980s, which was very influential in the Reagan administration, arguing that when government benefits are too generous, it actually increases poverty rather than reducing poverty, because it creates very strong disincentives for people to work, and work tends to be one of the best routes out of poverty. So all of these hypotheses, claims, or arguments had these two common features. They assert that there's a tipping point. In each case, it shouldn't be controversial at all that that's true. Secondly, they assert that the United States, or the relevant country, was in a particular spot in relation to that tipping point. Okay, I say all of this because the income inequality is harmful hypotheses have exactly the same features. Each of them asserts that there's a tipping point. I don't think anybody who's carefully thought about it would disagree with the notion that if there were zero income inequality, that would be pretty bad for a society. What that would require is that government takes all your money and redistributes it equally to everybody, or that it imposes exactly the same salary and pay. And that would create all kinds of disincentives to do anything. Probably it would be bad for health, happiness, educational. Would have an incentive, or very few people would have an incentive to develop their skills to go to college. Some people would anyway, but far fewer. So that seems relatively uncontroversial, that there is some tipping point somewhere. Also, I think even the most ardent conservative wouldn't dispute the notion that if one person, one household got all the income, that would be really bad too. So if there were complete, horrible income inequality, that's almost certainly bad. So there's a tipping point somewhere in between. The real question, though, is where are existing affluent democratic countries like the United States and others in relation to that tipping point, to that optimal level of income inequality. And those making the income inequality is harmful claim, whether it's Joe Stiglitz or Robert Reich or Wilkinson and Pickett or many, many others, including current presidents, including me, I've made some of these claims myself, are making the second assertion as well. And that's the one that we need to test empirically. So nobody really disputes, nobody's thought about it carefully, disputes that there is a tipping point, that in other words, that this first part of the hypothesis is correct, is accurate. The real question is, are we in fact on the wrong side of that tipping point already? All of these hypotheses are very plausible, but so is the big government is harmful hypothesis. The claim that Art Laffer and Milton Friedman and Charles Murray and Ronald Reagan and many, many others were making, it's completely plausible too. And there was some suggestive supportive evidence. Many conservatives took the combination of those two things, the plausibility of the hypothesis and the fact that there was, you could point to some suggestive supportive evidence, as sufficient to believe, to buy the notion that big government was bad and that we were already past the tipping point. We were on the wrong side of the so-called freedom Charles Murray. I don't think that's good enough. I don't think it was good enough then, and it ought not be good enough now with respect to the income inequality hypothesis. We should use a fairly tough evidentiary standard, just as we would have wanted Arthur Laffer to do a lot better in terms of his assessment of the evidence and not just throw out this claim. It's a very plausible claim, maybe some supporting evidence. The United States economy didn't grow as rapidly in the 1970s as it had in the 50s and 60s. Ergo, you could say, well, it must be because government's gotten too big. So the government had grown through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Well, Joe Stiglitz in his book, The Price of Inequality, says something quite similar. He says, look, the American economy grew faster in the 50s and 60s when income inequality was lower than it has since the late 1970s, when income inequality has been higher and rising. That's true. The hypothesis is plausible. But is that good enough evidence? I don't think so, because a lot of other things changed during this period too, and they could explain why the economy's grown a little more slowly. So what I'm saying to you, and I say this because I know that most of you your sympathies are left of center, at least that's my strong suspicion, as mine are, that if you wanted to hold Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan to a tough evidentiary standard and not just accept their claim as manifest, they're obviously true, simply because it was plausible and there was some suggestive evidence that one could point to, you ought to do the same thing for Joe Stiglitz and Robert Reich and Lane Kenworthy and Alec Gibney and anybody else, Wilkinson and Pickett, anybody else who makes this now, I think, quite popular income inequality is harmful claim. Okay, so how should we go about assessing this? Well, I'm going to focus on countries. It's not the only way to do it. You could use evidence based on individuals or the American states or localities, metro areas. I'm going to focus on countries, in part because that's the kind of research that I tend to do, but also because nations or countries are the unit where the chief policy levers that can affect income inequality are located. That mainly has to do with taxing and government transfers and also regulatory policies like the minimum wage and other things. They're not the only one, especially in a country like the United States where states actually have a fair amount of policy influence or policy capability, but they're far and away the primary one. So I don't want to suggest to you that this is the only type of evidence to look at, but I think it's the best place to start. Now, if we're going to look at countries, we could do a couple of things. One is we could compare within a country over time. That's pretty problematic for reasons I just alluded to a moment ago. So you could compare how the United States did on health or economic growth or something like that in the 1950s and 60s versus how it's been doing more recently. It's problematic because so many things change within a country from one period to the next. It's really difficult to say, well, if we have a different outcome, it must be due to the fact that we have higher income inequality now. You can make that assertion, but it's really problematic because so many other things have changed. Another possibility is to compare across countries at a given point in time. And this is what Wilkinson and Pickett in their Spirit Level book do. They show a lot of graphs that show the level of income inequality correlated with the level of life expectancy, let's say, or violent crime, or happiness, as we can measure happiness, and other outcomes. That tends to be a little better than just looking at one country and how it changes over time, but it too is really problematic. If you look at this Wilkinson and Pickett book, you'll see a lot of charts that look very supportive of the hypothesis that income inequality is bad for all kinds of outcomes. But the problem is that countries like Sweden and Denmark, let's say, which have lower income inequality than the United States, differ from the U.S. in many other ways. They have different cultures, they have different policies, they have different systems of government to some extent. They're all fundamentally democratic, but they have different policy-making procedures. So there, too, it's a little dicey, especially when there are only about 20 of these rich countries that you can really fairly compare with one another. It's a little bit dicey to draw the inference that it must be income inequality that's driving these or causing these different outcomes. So our best, and I don't want to get too much into the technical details of this, but our best bet from an analytical point of view is to compare changes within these countries over time. Now, as it happens, so that's this third option, star here. As it happens, within the 20 or so rich, long-standing democratic countries that we have in the world, out of about 193 or 4 countries, I can't remember exactly how many we had at last count, there's been a lot of variation, there's a lot of difference across these countries in the degree to which income inequality has changed in the last generation, since roughly the late 1970s. That's the period of rising inequality in the United States, but to a lesser degree in other countries. Now, I won't kind of bore you with the technical details of this either, but there are 2 measures of income inequality. One looks at the difference between the 1% and everyone else. Those data come from tax records. There's another measure of income inequality which is commonly used, which comes from data based on household surveys. So our Census Bureau every year at one point asks about 60,000 households what their income was in the previous year. And that gives us a measure that's usually referred to as a Gini coefficient. It's kind of a technical measure of income inequality. But the key thing to know is simply that that tells us nothing about the 1%, because those people usually aren't included in the survey, and when they are, their incomes are usually just coded at $1 million. So even if Oprah Winfrey ends up in the survey, her true income is not going to be marked down in the survey. They know from long experience that if you do that, most of those people will hang up the phone, or they'll kindly usher you out of their house because they don't want to tell you what they're very, very high incomes. So anyway, we have these 2 different measures. One gives us a good sense of the difference between the top 1% and everybody else. The other gives us a pretty good sense of inequality within the bottom 99%. On this graph, I show both of the 2, and then the darker dots are just an average of the 2 measures. They don't really tell very different stories, but nevertheless, I'm going to show you the 2 different measures in some of the outcomes. The key thing to see here is simply that there is a lot of variation, a lot of difference among these 20 rich countries in the degree to which income inequality has changed, has gone up over the last generation. We, sorry to say, lead the pack with the United Kingdom not far behind. Then you get down to countries like France and the Netherlands and Switzerland and Denmark, and they've had no rise, or in a few cases, a very small decrease in income inequality over this period. So we can use this variation for analytical leverage. It's almost akin to doing an experiment. It's not quite the same thing as an experiment, but it's somewhat close to an experiment where we look at these countries at the beginning point in time, and then we introduce this change, like we give them a new drug or something like this, or a vitamin supplement, let's say, and then we look at their outcome later on, and we see if the outcome change correlates with the change in the hypothesized cause, in this case income inequality. If it does, then we conclude that maybe there's an effect there. It's not foolproof evidence, but it's much better than the 2 other ways that I mentioned, which is looking at change over time just within one country, or looking, comparing across countries, but only at a single point in time. All right. There are lots of other technical details that I'm not going to bother you with, and I'm just going to, so that I don't go on too long, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of what the evidence suggests. So I'll say a bit about economic growth and just read through the rest, and I'm happy to go back in detail if you want me to, or not. So here's what the evidence suggests for economic growth, one of the main outcomes that we're interested in. So 2 charts here. Along the horizontal axis is change in income inequality for these countries. This shows you one measure. This is income inequality within the bottom 99%, and this is income inequality between the 1% and the 99%. And on the vertical axis is economic growth, or change in gross domestic product per capita. This is a measure of economic growth. What we would expect to see if income inequality is bad for economic growth is that the countries with no increase in inequality, or maybe a slight decrease in inequality, they'd be up here with kind of fast economic growth over this period. And the countries with a big rise in income inequality, they'd be down here with lower economic growth. That's not what we see. In fact, if anything, we see a slight upward trend of the line, but that's kind of meaningless. This is basically a flat line that you see here. not at all supportive of the hypothesis that income inequality has been bad for economic growth. And it turns out that I'm not the only one who's found this. Not a whole lot of people, not a whole lot of social scientists have studied this over the last 15 or 20 years, but the few that have reached essentially the same conclusion. I'm sorry to say, as much as I admire Joe Stiglitz for the work that he's done over the last, 30 years or so during his career, I think he's a wonderful economist. In his book, The Price of Inequality, he's very cavalier about the evidence on this question. And in fact, he goes so far as to make the assertion, not only does he sort of lend a lot of credence to this very simplistic comparison of U.S. economic growth in the 50s and 60s versus the period since the late 1970s, but he also states that it's been shown, when we compare across countries, that income inequality tends to be bad for economic growth. The problem is that there are some studies that find this, but they find that it's true exclusively for poor countries around the world. And that's very easy to understand. The reason why income inequality tends to be bad for economic growth in poor countries is, first of all, that a lot of parents keep their kids out of school because they're so poor in order to work. And I'm not talking about college, I'm talking about elementary and secondary school. And that's really bad for economic growth. Education is one of the main drivers of economic growth. But that doesn't happen in rich countries. Maybe there are a few families that do, but hardly anybody's keeping their kids out of elementary and secondary school in order to work. And secondly, income inequality foments political instability, which also tends to be really bad for economic growth. But Occupy Wall Street notwithstanding, there are no governments in rich countries that have been threatened, much less toppled or overthrown because of too much income inequality. So the key mechanisms that drive this association in many of the world's countries, they simply don't apply in rich countries. And Stiglitz, for whatever reason, didn't look up the studies that have been done that focus mainly on rich countries. So it turns out that, as best we can tell, in this period of rising income inequality, it hasn't been bad for economic growth. Doesn't mean that it will never be bad. It simply means the most relevant available evidence we have so far suggests that it hasn't. Economic stability, same thing tends to be true. It could be that income inequality contributed to the 2008 financial crisis, but the best, I haven't done this myself, but the best study that's looked systematically over time and across countries finds that there's no real correlation between income inequality, the level of income inequality or changes in income inequality and the likelihood of a financial crisis. Now, that doesn't necessarily speak to what's going to happen going forward, but it just means the best evidence we have available suggests that there's no systematic link. There is a link, I find, between income inequality and household income growth for the middle class. I mentioned earlier that this is almost certain to be true just by simple arithmetic. Unless income inequality also increases economic growth, and I just showed you a minute ago that there's really no link between this, or unless it comes mainly at the expense of the near rich, or maybe mainly at the expense of the poor, it's almost certain to be the case that when the 1% are getting a lot more of the income, of the increase in income, then that means less can go to the middle class. And we see this across countries, especially if we look at this chart here. Now, it looks like the countries are kind of arrayed around this line. It has the line has the negative slope that the income inequality hypothesis predicts. If we put our hand over Germany, and especially if we put our hand over Germany and the UK, the pattern is even stronger, suggesting that when income inequality goes up, household income for the middle class grow a lot more slowly. And it turns out, I won't bother to go into the details, but it turns out that Germany and the UK really are exceptions to this rule for kind of peculiar idiosyncratic reasons. So excluding them probably gives us a more accurate picture of what's really going on. And the pattern does fit almost perfectly with what the income inequality is harmful hypothesis expects. That doesn't hold for the poor, interestingly. So we would expect the same to be true. When the 1% are getting more and more of the income, then the poor probably should suffer. But it turns out that it's not the case, because in rich countries in the last several decades, when incomes of poor households go up, it's almost entirely because government transfers have gone up, not because market incomes have gone up. The bottom 20% of the population in most of these rich countries is very heavily dependent on government transfers. Some are elderly, some are disabled, some are unemployed, some simply don't work, for a whole slew of reasons. Now, it could be that when income inequality goes up, that means policymakers pay less attention to the poor, and so they're less likely to increase government transfers. But we don't see systematic evidence of that either. And a nice illustration is the contrast between the US and the UK. So in the United Kingdom, income inequality went up almost as much as it did here in the last generation. But at least after 1997, when the new Labour governments came in, policymakers did an awful lot to funnel incomes, more and more income to the poor. The Blair and Gordon Brown governments didn't talk a whole lot about that. They mostly focused on equality of opportunity and getting more people into employment. But kind of behind the scenes, they actually dramatically increased government transfers and a whole set of policies to low-end households in a way that our governments here in the United States simply didn't do. So I mean, that's just two countries, but it's an illustration of the fact that there's no apparent systematic link between changes in income inequality and changes in household incomes for the poor. You can have rising inequality and nevertheless rapidly growing incomes for the poor if policymakers decide that they want to make those incomes grow. And that's what they did in the UK, at least for part of the period. Not so much during the Margaret Thatcher years prior to 1997. Between 97 and 2007 or 2010, they very much did. Okay, household balance sheets. I'm going to skip over this and be happy to come back to it, but it's kind of a complicated story. Equality of opportunity. The punchline here is that while there's some suggestive evidence that income inequality might be bad for mobility between generations, which is our best measure of equality of opportunity, it's very thin evidence, as it turns out, and there are other things that could explain the pattern that we see in the data here. Most importantly, a lot of this correlation is driven by the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland. And in addition to the fact that they have very low income inequality, they also do a lot more of the kind of educational things, schooling-related things that many researchers expect to have a very strong effect on equalization of chances for kids who grow up in poor households versus middle class versus the rich. So they've had universal early education programs for nearly a generation now. They have very late tracking in their K through 12 schooling systems. And they also make fairly high quality universities, and they're very, very low cost for the whole population. That includes obviously the poor. So it could very well be that these things, rather than their low levels of income inequality, are explaining why they're up here fairly high on intergenerational mobility, which again is our best, not a perfect measure, but it's our best measure of equality of opportunity. I'll deal with the details of those. Education, so I'm just going to skip over some of the details. The charts here are very similar to the ones I showed you before, so just two different measures of change in income inequality, and this is change in college completion. And it turns out that the pattern doesn't match what we'd expect. Countries with bigger increases in income inequality haven't suffered in terms of the share of the population that graduates from college. We're down here in the lower right, which is what the hypothesis predicts, but the other countries, there's no real systematic pattern. And part of the reason we're down here is because we actually started this period with a comparatively high rate of college graduation. So we massively expanded college in the 60s and through the 1970s, and partly because of the Vietnam draft, lots of Americans flooded into college and stayed, lots of American males anyway, and stayed. So by the late 70s, we had a pretty high rate of college graduation compared to lots of these other countries. But they very quickly caught up, and we haven't done much in the way of increasing. Could conceivably be because of income inequality, but the fact that we don't see this pattern at all with any of the other countries suggests a lot of grounds for skepticism. Life expectancy, very similar story. Here we see something of the expected pattern, a kind of downward slope here. So countries with bigger increase in the top 1%'s income share have seen slower growth of life expectancy, but it's at best, it's a really small player in the overall story. So to put some numbers on this here, I can tell you that I think in my calculations, the most defensible estimate is that an increase in income inequality of the magnitude that we've experienced, which is a very large one in the last generation, might reduce growth of life expectancy by about half a year. I don't want to sneeze at half a year, but on the other hand, the average for all of these rich countries was an increase of about 6 years in life expectancy during this period. So late 1970s to, I should have told you that all of these analyses stopped right before the economic crisis. So they go from roughly late 70s to about 2007. So what that's suggesting is that even if income inequality has actually been bad for average health, it's a really small player. And policymakers who are trying to figure out how to improve their country's life expectancy probably should look to a lot of other things before income inequality, if they're willing to make it again. Family stability, the only good measure we have that we can do this kind of comparison for is teen births, and we don't really see any evidence that income inequality is bad. Same with violent crime. Our only real good measure here is homicides, and we don't see any systematic pattern across the country. Residential mixing is one other area where we do see evidence. I can't do a cross-country comparison because we don't have the data that we need in order to do this for most of the other countries. But Sean Reardon, who's a social scientist at Stanford, and a colleague have done a nice study comparing metropolitan areas within the United States, metro areas. And they do the same kind of analysis that I do. And what they find is that metro areas in which income inequality has increased the fastest have seen the largest increase in segregation, residential segregation. So the opposite of residential mixing. And as it happens, what they find is that the substance of this increase in residential segregation mainly has to do with the rich separating themselves from everyone else, so gating themselves off in separate communities. It's not so much an increase in segregation between the middle class and the poor or any other element of society. It's really the rich separating from everyone else. And that's kind of consistent with the nature of the increase in income inequality here, which has been heavily a sort of separation between the 1% and everybody else. So again, the evidence is limited to the United States, but it's very consistent with the hypothesis. For generalized trust, which has gotten kind of a lot of attention in some circles recently, we do see the predicted pattern, but it really hinges on two countries, Denmark and the UK. They're in the expected positions here, so big increase in inequality for the UK and big decline in trust. This comes from public opinion surveys where people are asked something along the lines of, do you feel most people in your society can be trusted? Or on the other hand, do you feel that you can't be too careful in dealing with other people? And so what I'm looking at here is change in this measure during this period from the late 70s through 2007 or so. Big decline in the UK, and they're one of the countries. US is a little bit similar. And big increase in generalized trust in Denmark. Well, it could be that those two countries are in the positions they're in because of differences in income inequality, but there are other stories that one can tell that I find actually a little bit more plausible. And so I don't put too much stock in the fact that this line actually follows the income inequality as harmful hypothesis. And for happiness, we have two different measures, but once again, we see no systematic evidence. Now, okay, let me say just a little bit about democracy. We're going on a little longer than I should have, but I'll end very soon. Okay, so the argument about democracy pertains or applies mainly to the United States because we're the country that has a political system in which private money is most heavily injected or most influential in the system. Now, there's every reason to expect that in the United States, those with more money tend to have more political influence. It's not that they get more votes, but of course they're able to use their money to lobby and to donate to campaigns, and so it's very likely that they're going to be able to sway policymakers to do what they want, more than the middle class and the poor. That seems utterly plausible and defensible, but quite remarkably, up until very recently, we actually had no real systematic evidence that that was true. Almost nobody would have believed that it wasn't true, would have denied that it was true. But we had no real strong evidence until two political scientists, Larry Bartels, who's now at Vanderbilt, and Martin Gilens, who's at Princeton, did these very nice studies, and this chart summarizes what they found. This is from Martin Gilens' very recent book, Affluence and Influence. So what both of them did is they went and looked at public opinion surveys, where people are asked their opinion on all kinds of possible policy changes. Should same-sex marriage be legalized? Should government do more to reduce income differences between rich and poor? And most of these surveys also come with a question that says, what's your household income? So what they can do is look and see if policy preferences differ between the rich and the middle class and the poor. And so Gillen's, for example, looks at the 90th percentile of the income distribution. That's kind of up near the top, so let's call them the rich or the upper middle class. And the 10th percentile, that's down near the bottom, the poor. And then what they did is they went and looked at the policies where questions were asked, and they looked over subsequent years to see if Congress and the President actually made changes. And then they looked to see if the changes they made or didn't make correspond more closely with the policy preferences, as judged by the public opinion survey, of the rich or the poor. And here's what they found. So, so Gillen's went back and looked at the 1960s, and then he skipped the 70s for reasons I'm not really sure about. This is a very, very labor-intensive effort, looking at all these surveys and then looking at policy changes afterwards. So 60s, 80s, 90s, and then about halfway through the two George W. Bush administrations, 2000 to 2006. Okay. Now, so this is for the 10th percentile, the poor. It doesn't matter. So this is the percentage of them favoring the change, and this is then the likelihood that the change actually is enacted. When, let's say, 10% of the poor favor a policy change, there's about a 35% change likelihood that it'll actually get enacted subsequently. When almost 100% of the poor favor a change, there's still only about a 35% likelihood that it'll get enacted. Doesn't matter how many of the poor, let's call them poor, favor the change. No effect on policy outcomes. For those at the 90th percentile, very strong effect. When very few of them favor the change, it still happens occasionally, maybe 15% of the time. When most of them favor the change, it doesn't guarantee that it'll happen, but it does happen about 60% of the time. And the point is, the more the rich favor the change, the more the likelihood that it'll actually happen, whereas for the poor, no effect at all. This, let me just state again, because it's really quite remarkable. This is the only real systematic evidence that we have that the rich actually have a lot more influence on policy outcomes in the United States than the poor. Again, almost nobody would deny or think that that isn't true, because we all know that there's a lot of ways that money can get into our political system. But the proof was, in a systematic way, lacking until Bartels and Gillen's did this story. But now, coming back to the income inequality as harmful hypothesis, what we really want to know is whether the influence of the rich has increased as income inequality has gone up. It's one thing to say that they have more influence than the poor at any moment in time, but given how much income inequality has gone up, if we're to worry about this with respect to democracy, it's because the amount of influence that the rich exert has gone up. And here's a summary chart. I've just taken these from Martin Gillen's book that gives us the only real evidence that we have, again, systematic evidence that we have on this question. So this is again 10th percentile and 90th percentile. The white bars are for the 10th and the dark bars are for the 90th. If these two bars are level, this is a different way of showing this, but if these two bars are level, that means these two groups have roughly the same amount of influence on policy. And going along here, we're going forward in time. So Lyndon Johnson administration, Ronald Reagan's two administrations, Bill Clinton, and the first six of George W. Bush's 8 years. Gillen stops in 2006. During Lyndon Johnson's term, 1.5 terms in office, actually the two groups had roughly the same influence. And just as an aside, this isn't really relevant to the inequality hypothesis, but one of the other things you can see is that a lot of the stuff Johnson did was not really what Americans, either the rich or the poor, wanted. These two bars are very low. He did almost all of it on his own. In hindsight, we like to think, especially those of us who are kind of lefty-oriented, that Johnson was just kowtowing to what the American people wanted. Not so much. Anyway, 20 years later, during the Reagan administration, the bars look very different. The bar for the rich is high, the bar for the poor is actually negative. So that's exactly what the inequality hypothesis would predict. because inequality started going up in the 80s, after the late 1970s. During the Clinton administration, if anything, maybe even more of a gap here. That too is consistent with the inequality hypothesis, and it's kind of striking because, of course, Clinton's a Democrat. So if even a Democratic president is listening more to the rich than to the poor, that suggests that inequality may have a strong influence. But here's the problem. Going further in time, during the first 6 years of the George W. Bush administration, the bars are much closer together. They're not exactly equal as they were way back in the 60s for Johnson, but they're much closer together. That's not at all what the inequality, the income inequality hypothesis leads us to expect. Now, it could be that this was kind of an exceptional period. I mean, 9/11 may introduce a lot of quirkiness into this pattern because the parties for a few years agreed on more things than they might otherwise have done. So maybe, you know, the rich didn't dominate policy to the extent that they would have given income inequality. We don't know. It's possible that's true, but what I simply want to tell you is that, again, this is the only systematic evidence we have. Martin Gilens is the only one who's done this kind of thing. So it's the best that we can do. Otherwise, we're just telling stories and offering impressionistic evidence. So I think it's quite likely that it's true that as income inequality has increased, the rich have exerted more and more political influence. But that's not, at least if we take seriously what the data suggests for the George W. Bush administration, that's not what the data tell us so far. So we need more studies on this. Okay, so let me just wrap up. My sort of bottom line conclusion is that there is evidence that income inequality has had harmful effects. It has slowed middle-class income growth, which I happen to think is one of our most important social problems and one of this country's biggest failings over the last generation is that middle-class household incomes have grown much more slowly than the economy would allow. It's been true as well in other countries that have experienced a big increase in income inequality, especially this sort of 1% versus 99% income inequality. Income inequality has probably reduced residential mixing, increased residential segregation. It's very likely increased disparities in health, education, and happiness. I didn't go over the data there. We don't really have it across countries, but that's very likely to be true, and the evidence within the United States over time is consistent with that. It's also probably increased inequality of political influence, although again, it's not far from a slam dunk case as best we can tell. But I also want to suggest to you, and you've already gleaned this, I hope you're paying attention, that for a lot of the inequality hypotheses, we don't have very good evidence in favor of them. And so I think we should be much more skeptical than many of us, including me, are inclined to be when we hear, again, a very plausible story and some suggestive supportive evidence. Because the best evidence that we have, I think, doesn't tend to support some of these. Okay, let me just go to the very final thing I want to say. So coming back to the question I posed in the title, should we worry about income inequality? My answer is yes, but not necessarily for some of the most prominent reasons that have been offered in the recent debate. First and foremost, I think the fairness argument remains as strong as ever. It's been kind of shunted to the side by a lot of people because well, first of all, folks have been making that for a long time, and a lot of people think it just hasn't made much headway. Some think it's unfair, but many others don't, and they're not really going to change their mind. So as these arguments about harmful consequences have risen up to in the political debate, I think a lot of people have said, well, let's forget about the fairness argument because it never really worked and focus on this harmful consequences argument. But I think the fairness argument remains as strong as ever. Indeed, arguably much stronger in a country like the United States, because if we thought the level of income inequality in the late 70s was unfair, then surely you think that the level of income inequality today is unfair. Second, as I said, there's good evidence that it reduces middle-class household income growth, increases inequality of education, health, and happiness, and reduces residential mixing. And then the very last thing I want to say is that even though we don't have very strong, compelling evidence that it's increased inequality of political influence here in the U.S., I think we're taking a very big gamble if we assume that the lack of systematic evidence means that it isn't true. If we we conclude from that chart from Martin Gillen's that I showed you before, which says, well, you know, it looked like it was true up through the Clinton administration, but then in the Bush administration, the evidence goes in the other direction. And the reason for that is partly that we care so much about democracy. It's so fundamental to a modern society and to what the way we think of our country. But then the other thing is, if in fact the rich are having more and more political influence, that can have all kinds of spillover effects on other elements of society, from economic growth to health to education to these other things we care about down the road in ways that we just can't predict them. So even if we don't have slam dunk evidence now that there's growing inequality of political influence, it's I think a very big gamble, and one that I'm not very willing to take, to just assume that, well, so maybe there's not so much of a problem in our political system, in our democracy. Okay, I'll end there. Take questions and comments if you have them.
Thank you, first of all. We do like evidence, so that's very interesting.
Do you want me to just call some people? Do you want me to call?
Yes, why not?
Okay.
Very educational. It's anti-intuitive in many ways. Two questions. How do you think your curves would have changed if you had used measures of wealth and purchasing power? And secondly, how do you define income? And thirdly, is all of this in your book?
What was the third one again?
Is this information included in your book?
So to answer the third, it's not included in the book that I showed at the very beginning. It's just come out. But I'm writing this all of this now into a book. But it'll probably be a year before it appears. I mean, I've written up almost all this material, but the book itself is only about halfway done. So hopefully it won't be too long, but we'll see. Okay, in answer to the other questions, it would be very good to be able to do this kind of thing with wealth, but we don't have the data on this. Remarkably, given how important wealth, many of us think wealth is, we don't have very good data on the distribution of wealth for many other countries. We've got good data here in the United States, but for many other rich countries, remarkably, we don't have great data on the distribution of wealth. We're starting to get a little bit more, but it doesn't go very far back in time. So if I were to try to do this sort of thing with wealth, I'd be confined to about 8, maybe 10 countries. And I couldn't do any analysis of change over time, over any lengthy period. It would have to be looking at the relationship between inequality of wealth in, say, 2005 or 2007 and the various outcomes. And that's not really a very good way to do this type of analysis. So it's really just a data problem. For purchasing power, the same thing roughly is true. We simply don't have very good data the usual measure of this is referred to as consumption. And we've got pretty good data on this for the United States. It also goes back in time, but not so much for other countries. Strikingly, we have better data on consumption for some very poor countries than we do for rich countries, because the World Bank for a while has been collecting data on consumption. It did this when it started doing household surveys in poor countries a couple of decades ago. It intentionally tried to measure consumption rather than income, because so many people are outside the formal labor market. They're engaged in subsistence agriculture. They have zero income, but that's no indicator at all of their real living standards. There are far fewer such people in rich countries, and so most government agencies, when they do household surveys, they for a long time ask people about their income, on the assumption that that's not really missing very many folks, and that's a reasonable assumption. But so the short answer to your question is we just can't because of data limitations.
What about the definition of income? What is that?
Right, the definition of income. So it comes from two sources, and this gets back to these two different ways of measuring income that I mentioned. One is a sort of 1% versus everybody else, and the other is inequality within the bottom 99%. So the 1% versus everybody else information, that comes from tax records, which is the only real way that we can get at incomes of the very rich, because they just don't participate in these household surveys, and when they do, the researchers are forced to engage in this so-called top coding practice, where they say, look, if you tell me your income is $30 million, I'm just going to record it as $1 million. They do this again they sacrifice some information in the interest of getting reasonably accurate information, because otherwise the rich just they
Was
simply
that
don't.
adjusted gross income then, like taxes?
Yeah, so for the income inequality within the bottom 99%, which comes from household surveys, it includes taxes and government transfers. It's a very comprehensive measure of income. For the 1% versus everyone else, it's a pre-tax measure, because that's what we have from the tax record data. That's not really what we would want ideally, but it's the best that we can do. We simply don't have the information that would incorporate taxation.
Thank you.
On one of your graphs, you have till 207, and things have really been going down since 207.
So it's a good question. Why would I stop these analyses at 2007 before the economic crisis? And the main part of the answer is data limitations. For a number of these things, we don't have data going through to the end of the crisis. And this is kind of a technical detail, but when you're doing these kind of over-time comparisons, you want to make sure that you start and end at similar points in the business cycle. And so, as it happens, 1979 was a peak business cycle year, and 2007, right before the crash, was a peak business cycle year. So that makes sense. A second reason is that the economic crisis and the crash and the very slow recovery, but also variable recovery depending on the country you're looking at, that arguably is, to a large extent, independent of income inequality. Now, that might be wrong. There are some people who assert that it was all about income inequality. It was a major precipitant of the crisis. But of course, the crisis spills over into all kinds of countries, that even many that didn't have a big increase in income inequality. France and Denmark, for example, where income inequality hasn't changed at all. But because the crisis goes all over the world, it affects them just as much. A country like France, maybe even more than a country like the United States, which was a big increase in inequality country, and also the one where the crisis really started and then spills over. I guess those are the two main reasons for not including the crisis. Now, if I were to wait until whatever the peak year ends up being of this business cycle, hopefully it's not for a long time. Hopefully our economy will keep growing and grow even faster than it has been. Maybe it will be 2020, but for all I know, it could be 2016, and then we go into another recession. I hope that's not the case. Anyway, if we had data up to the peak year of the business cycle that we're now in, then I would probably include that in these kind of analyses.
One of your slides showed that income equality didn't really have an impact on economic growth. But then you showed another slide where income inequality had a direct impact on household income diminishing. And I'm curious, can you explain why the lack of household income wouldn't impact or have a stronger impact on economic growth? Is it not that large of an impact?
That's right. It's a great question. And in fact, this gets at the heart of the hypothesis that Stiglitz and many other people, Robert Reich, are offering about why income inequality probably is bad for you. And they think it's likely to be bad for economic growth. It's precisely because when income inequality goes up, especially if it's a sort of 1% versus everyone else rise in inequality, that means the top 1% are gobbling up most of the growth in household incomes, which means middle-class household incomes are growing more slowly. And that's in fact what I find to be true so far. And then the hypothesis says, well, the middle class is the major source of consumer demand. They're the ones that spend most of their money. They're a big group also. Most of these rich societies, you have a large middle class. And so when income inequality is going up, you're likely to get less consumer demand than you otherwise would have. We need a lot of demand for the economy to grow. Therefore, you're going to have slower economic growth. It's utterly plausible. But the evidence from the rich countries in the last generation, from the late 1970s up through 2007, simply isn't supportive. What that's suggesting, and here's a key to unlocking this puzzle. we don't really know, and when I say we, I mainly mean economists, but social scientists more broadly, we don't really know what the optimal balance between savings and investment on the one hand and consumption on the other hand is. So a generation ago, there were people like Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan who were saying, not only should the size of government be lower, but we would benefit from more income inequality, because the rich are the one, if the rich had a larger share of the income, they're the ones that do most of the saving and investment. I think almost everybody else has to spend almost everything they have, so the middle class might save a little bit. And they were saying, that's what the American economy needs right now. We need more savings and more investment. That's where our shortfall is. Nowadays, there are others, like Stiglitz, who are saying what the American economy needs is more demand. That's where the shortfall is. Either one could be true at any given point in time. The truth is, we don't know. There's a separate element of this, which is that folks like Paul Krugman and to some extent Stiglitz, but many other people have been saying that in this economic crisis, we need more demand. That's where the shortfall is. That's almost always true in recessionary periods. But the argument about income inequality having this bad effect is not confined just to recessions in the 1 or 2 years when the economy is in a recession, and then it's good for government to shovel a bunch of money in, or maybe introduce tax cuts for the middle class, or spend more. That's the argument Krugman has been making. But that's very different from the argument that says we need more consumer demand in order to get more long-term economic growth. And that's the sort of Stiglitz type of argument here. Very plausible, but it doesn't seem to be true across these economies. There's simply no indication that countries which have had a big rise in income inequality and slower income growth for their middle-class households than would otherwise be the case, have grown any more slowly than countries with no increase in inequality or even a decline in inequality.
Do you think looking at the same information as in terms of a global marketplace instead of country by country would impact the data in terms of job shift overseas versus job growth in the U.S.? Instead of looking at the U.S. economic growth in and of itself, it seems like we're very connected in terms of a global marketplace, so that over the last, 20 years, the outsourcing of jobs would have deeply impacted the consumer ability to increase demand in the U.S. by itself. So does it skew, do you think, these charts somewhat?
It could, but the real question then is whether that differs across countries in a way that would make this uninformative. So in other words, if it were the case that there was something going on about globalization that was causing these countries that haven't really seen much increase in inequality to grow more slowly than they otherwise would. So the point being that maybe in the absence of this other factor, let's say it's globalization, these countries really would be up here as the inequality is bad hypothesis predicts it would be. I don't know, I haven't heard anybody make that kind of argument that's actually true. I suppose it's conceivable, but I'm pretty skeptical that it's true.
It seems like there's a bit of a dearth of data to kind of help inform us on a lot of these aspects.
Well, yeah, so yes and no. I emphasize the limitations of data when I was talking about political influence, and to some degree some of these other things like residential mixing. But these data are pretty good. The limitation here is that we only have 20 countries. It would be a lot, and when you only have 20 data points, it's possible that 1 or 2 or 3 exert a lot of influence on the pattern that you do or don't see. So ideally it would be, just purely for analytical purposes, it would be better if we had more rich countries in the world. Now some people say, well, we can overcome this by including other countries. Again, we have about 193, 194 countries in the world. Absolutely the wrong way to go, because there's no reason to think that causal processes that occur in Mali or Malaysia or Iran have any relevance to what's going on in these rich countries. mentioned before the example of economic growth, where it very much is the case. The evidence strongly supports the notion that in poor countries, income inequality is bad for economic growth. But the reasons for that, the causal mechanisms or pathways, as we say, they simply don't apply to rich countries.
So I think the point, if I'm trying to actually understand what the message is here, but the point that is made here is that of course equality is bad, but to necessarily link it to the growth is not the right argument. And also I wanted to, the gentleman in the back who was making the point about the globalization, I think actually, I mean, and you said that the data is not, I think you kind of wave on that. That yes, you could have, there's no question about the inequality, the rising inequality in the United States and actually in Germany or in Great Britain. But there is also no question about the fact that the main measure of the growth, which is GDP, has been rising up in the United States in particular. So the rise in GDP, and that's I think the question, and I think that requires more discussion and more analysis, is that the rise in the GDP in the United States is particularly linked to the role that the United States plays globally. And so, I think those are but again, I think that I like to go out of here understanding that, of course inequality is bad. And I guess you're trying to say, and please help me understand this, that we have to put it on more solid ground than just linking it necessarily to the rise in linking it to the growth.
Yeah. So right. So let me try to clarify both things. What we see in this in these data here. So again, further to the right means a bigger increase in income inequality, and higher on the vertical axis means faster economic growth in these years since the late 1970s, stopping in 2007, so before the economic crisis. And one of the things we do see is that the United States did fairly well relative to these other countries. That's not what we'd expect if income inequality has a very harmful effect. Now you're suggesting, maybe you were suggesting too, that maybe our economic growth was artificially high because we have this privileged position in the world economy. I think that's what you're suggesting. Mm-hmm. Could be true, could very well be true, but I don't think that really helps a lot. So just take the United States out of the picture. You still don't see any indication that countries with a bigger rise in income inequality have suffered in terms of economic growth. It's still basically just a flat line. There's no systematic relationship between the two whatsoever. Now, to the question of what's my sort of bottom line conclusion, what I'm telling you, we have very good evidence that income inequality in rich countries has reduced the rate of income growth for middle-class households. That, I think, is a really bad thing. There might be some people who say, but I care a lot about that. So I think that's a bad effect. We've got good evidence, not quite as good, but pretty good evidence that income inequality has been bad for disparities in health. That is to say, the gap in life expectancy between the rich and the poor has increased. That's probably due in part, maybe in large part, to the rise in income inequality. Same with happiness. Same with college graduation rates for people's kids subsequently. I think those things are bad. We've got pretty good evidence that here in the United States, income inequality has caused increased residential segregation. Some people may not care about that too much. But at the same time, I think we do have fairly solid evidence that income inequality has had some harmful effects. But at the same time, for a lot of the hypotheses that are now floating around there, that people like Robert Reich and Stiglitz and Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett and the Spirit Level book that they did, we don't have very strong supportive evidence. I think it's perfectly okay for people to continue to offer this as a hypothesis, but what I'm suggesting to you is that when you hear people say, not only is this a hypothesis, but it's been proven that income inequality is bad should be scaled.
And we did see the Rob Rachel a couple months ago or so, and he made a lot of comparisons between the Great Depression and the present crisis. So if we put this data to the test back then, I mean, I don't know if there would be data for different countries or might be different countries, because some of them would be considered countries back then. But I wonder what we would see if we examine the data through that lens.
So he's got in this movie, he's got a great little chart that shows the top 1% share of all income. And we have data on this going back to 1913 because they come from tax records, and that's when the federal income tax was created. So that's when the IRS begins having data. And so the top 1% share goes up until 1928, and then of course the following year, Great Depression begins. Then it goes down continuously until about 1979, starts going back up again, and reaches another peak at almost the exact same level in 2007. And what happens the next year? The economy falls apart. Our second biggest crisis in the last 100, 150 years. It's a great chart, very compelling. So two things. The first is it's just 2 data points in one country. And so this study by Tony Atkinson, who's a very eminent British economist and a graduate student of his, Salvatore Morelli, they look at other countries and other periods of rising and or falling and high and or low income inequality. And they find that when you do this broader comparison, there really isn't any systematic link between either high income inequality and the likelihood of financial crisis or rising income inequality and the likelihood of financial crisis. Now, so what about the United States? Well, it could still be that even if there's no systematic link, it could still be that here in the United States, income inequality really was a precipitant, a cause of these 2 financial crises. But of course, there were lots of other things going on in the country besides rise in income inequality. And so it's suggestive evidence, but is it the kind of evidence that we would really want if we're going to conclude that yes, income inequality precipitates financial crisis? I don't think so. And let me buttress this kind of skeptical conclusion by pointing out an additional fact. So in Robert Reich's chart, we go up to 1928, then down, back up to 2007, and back down. Well, we're now right back up to where we were in 2007. So if you believe that level of the top 1% share of income causes financial crisis, you should expect another financial crisis to hit right now, next year. Maybe it'll happen. If it does, I'll probably jump on board with this conclusion. 2 times could be a fluke. 3 times, and it's probably systematic. But we'll see. I hope it doesn't happen.
What I want to ask is, can you have economic stability and still have increasing poverty? I mean, it seems to me that maybe the 1% can be creating economic stability in a world situation because they control the money and the CEOs of the big corporations are controlling the world, and we continue to have increasing poverty. And so that worries me, and what worries me is democracy. I don't see a surviving democracy. I see an oligarchy or something from all the money that's being put into
Yeah, so...
and I don't see that your statistics has changed my mind on any of that.
Okay. That's perfectly fine. I think with democracy is, I think, where our data are most limited. The fact that all we really have in terms of systematic evidence is these 2 studies by 2 political scientists, that should really tell you something. It's really quite a remarkable thing about social science that we have so little systematic evidence on inequality, political influence. But let me say a few things about poverty. So I think the key lesson to take from what I observe across the world's rich countries is that there's no strong connection between income inequality and poverty or changes in poverty. What that means is that poverty, the incomes of the poor, the level of income of those at the bottom of the income ladder in rich countries, and also change over time, it's largely a function of policy decisions. And when policymakers decide to make programs more generous, whether it's pensions for the elderly, unemployment assistance, or disability, or welfare, or earned income tax credit, or all of the above, then the incomes of the poor will be higher and they'll go up. When they don't, then they'll stagnate and they'll be lower than they otherwise would have. But there's no systematic relationship between those policy decisions, or at least there hasn't been in the last generation, and income inequality. And again, I go back to this US-United Kingdom comparison. The United Kingdom has experienced a virtually identical increase in income inequality to what we have, and yet policymakers made very different choices than, at least after 1997. Worldwide, I don't know if you were referring to kind of worldwide poverty or poverty in developing countries, but here too is another kind of interesting, it's not really a side note, it's actually really, really important, which is that poverty had been decreasing really dramatically across the world in the last generation. It's not that there's no poverty left, tons and tons of poor people in the world. But during this period, incomes for, and this is mainly driven by what's happened in China and to a lesser extent India, incomes have risen quite dramatically. There's been rising inequality within those two countries, but nonetheless the absolute incomes and living standards of, because these are such huge countries, literally billions of people have gone up to a really significant extent. At the same time, that income inequality has been rising in all the rich countries and even in those countries. So we have this kind of peculiar and very interesting phenomenon of increasing income inequality in many countries around the world to very different extents. Big increase in the United States in income inequality, not so much in France and Sweden and Denmark. We don't really know how much it's increased in China because the data are a little bit sketchy. But at the same time, and also I should say, an increase in inequality between a number of countries around the world. And what's happened there is that a number of countries in Africa, to a lesser extent Latin America, but to some degree Latin America and parts of East Asia, have not been growing as fast as the rich countries. So that's an increase in inequality between countries, but at the same time, a reduction in inequality between the rich countries and China and India. And that matters just because those countries have so many people. And those two countries have, about 2/7 of the world's population, about 2 billion people in those countries combined, out of 7 billion in the world. So the fact that they've been growing more rapidly than almost any other country in the world means that they've been catching up. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it has trickled down to their middle class and their poor. So that's been massive human progress in reducing poverty. If you phrase it in terms of, well, only 2 countries in the world have been catching up to the rich ones, then it sounds really bad. But because they have 2/7 of the world's population, it's been actually a huge improvement. So it's been a very mixed story, but definitely not entirely a pessimistic story, I guess.
Time for another question?